He thought he'd bought a ghost town, a forgotten place where nothing lived, nothing moved. But when he arrived, smoke rose from chimneys, gardens bloomed where only dust should be, and a woman with a rifle stood guard over a sick child. What he thought was his to claim wasn't empty at all. This discovery didn't just challenge his ownership, it shattered his world and forced him into a fight for justice that no one saw coming. Where are you watching this video from? Let us know in the comments below. And if you love stories that grip your heart and don't let go, don't forget to subscribe. Now, get ready, because this is a story about survival, courage, and the fight to reclaim what's rightfully yours. I still remember the day I bought that ghost town like it was yesterday, though it happened years ago. Boone Carter, that was the name on the deed. But back then, I was just a man chasing a new start. The deal was almost too good to be true. $100 for a whole town, or at least what was left of one. I imagined empty streets, collapsed buildings, dust blowing where once life bustled. A perfect place to build something new, or at least hold on to a piece of the past. When I arrived, I was ready to claim my property, to ride through deserted streets and survey the ruins. But what I saw made me halt. Smoke curling from a chimney where no fire should have burned. A garden with green shoots poking through soil that should have been dry and cracked. Then, the shadow, moving behind a cracked window, something alive in a place everyone had said was dead. And then, the woman. She stood in the doorway of the general store, her hands wrapped tight around a rifle. Not the welcome I'd expected. She was weathered like the town itself, eyes sharp, full of stories and warnings. I could see the weight she carried, something more than just survival. I told her I had the deed, that I owned the land, but she laughed, a bitter sound that cracked the quiet morning. Said the law didn't mean much when the bank comes for what it wants. She spoke of lost farms, lost homes, loans that never should have been, and how she and her granddaughter had nowhere else to go but here. Her granddaughter was sick, coughing deep inside that old store turned home. The child's fragile form struck something deep inside me. I hadn't expected a family, a life fighting for breath amid ruins and forgotten dreams. The sheriff came that day, a man with a badge and a smirk, followed by deputies who enjoyed their work a little too much. They came for the woman, for the child, for the debts they claimed she owed. But I stood in their way, knowing that law or no law, this was my land now, and I wasn't about to let them take away what little hope was left here. The first day set the tone for everything that followed. It wasn't just a ghost town anymore. It was a battleground. And I, a man who thought he'd just bought land, found myself at the heart of a fight that was bigger than any one of us. I'd barely had time to catch my breath before the truth started settling over me like the dust in this forsaken place. Dorothy Whitmore, her name was as worn and weathered as the wooden porch she stood on, the rifle in her hands less a weapon and more a shield against a world that had turned its back on her. She wasn't just guarding a building, she was guarding memories, a legacy stolen piece by a system rigged against folks like her. She told me about Thomas, her late husband, a man proud and stubborn, someone who refused to bend to the banks and their crooked games. He had worked this land, fought the sun and soil, kept his family afloat, but after he died, the vultures came circling. Loans that were never taken, papers with forged signatures, debts piling up like the tumbleweeds outside the town. The bank foreclosed without mercy, left Dorothy and her granddaughter Zara with nothing but a roof over their heads in this ghost town that was supposed to be empty. Zara was a fragile thing, no more than 8 years old, but she carried the weight of sickness in every shallow breath she took. Her cough echoed through the cracked walls, a harsh reminder that survival here wasn't just about shelter or food, but fighting for every heartbeat. Dorothy's eyes betrayed exhaustion, but beneath it was a fierce determination, a will that refused to let her family be swallowed by despair. I watched as she moved through the makeshift home they'd cobbled together inside the general store. Blankets hung as curtains, wooden crates stacked as furniture, a small fire crackling in the corner, trying to keep the cold at bay. Every detail told a story of resilience, but also fragility. They were clinging to this place like it was the last anchor in a sea of loss. I could feel the tension growing outside, like the calm before a storm. The sheriff and his deputies were circling closer, the law on their side but just as far from it. Dorothy's grip on that rifle was a silent promise that she wouldn't give up without a fight, but deep down, I knew the odds were stacked against her. That night, I sat by the fire with Dorothy and Zara, listening to the wind whistle through the broken windows. Dorothy told me stories about the families that had been swallowed by debts, people who vanished rather than face the cruelty of the banks and sheriffs like Crow. Names, faces, lives erased in the name of progress and profit. I realized then that this wasn't just a fight over land, it was a battle against a system built to exploit the vulnerable, to turn the desperate into pawns in a game they didn't understand. Dorothy wasn't just protecting her home, she was standing up for every lost soul who'd been crushed under the weight of lies and greed. I felt a strange kinship with her, a bond forged not by friendship but by the undeniable truth that sometimes, doing what's right means standing alone in the face of a storm. My deed gave me ownership, but it also gave me responsibility. A responsibility I hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I knew this was just the beginning. The land I'd bought was alive with stories, with people who refused to be forgotten. And whatever came next, I was going to stand with them, come hell or high water. The morning sun hadn't fully broken over the horizon when I first heard the thunder of hooves pounding against the cracked earth. It wasn't the lazy clatter of a lone rider coming for a friendly visit. No, this was a herd, a storm riding fast and hard straight for the ghost town that was supposed to be mine, supposed to be empty. The sound stirred something deep inside me, a primal warning that trouble was coming, the kind that could swallow a man whole if he wasn't ready. I stepped out onto the porch, dust swirling in the pale light, and saw them. 3 men riding like they owned the land, which, until that morning, maybe they thought they did. Their leader was a lean man with eyes cold enough to freeze the river in midwinter, and a badge that caught the sun with a sharp glint. Sheriff Marcus Crow. The name was whispered in towns from here to Millfield as a man who collected debts like a butcher collects scars, without mercy, without question. Behind him rode 2 deputies, faces set hard like they'd carved them from stone, smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The kind of men who took pleasure in their work, the kind that made you wish you'd never crossed paths. Dorothy didn't flinch. She stood in the doorway of the general store, rifle in hand, body tense but steady. The weight of 1,000 fights hung on her shoulders, but she wasn't going anywhere. The sheriff pulled his horse to a halt outside the store, his gaze flicking between me, the smoke rising from the chimney, and the small garden pushing through the cracked earth. That garden, something alive in a town declared dead, was a challenge he didn't like. "Well, well," Crow said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd found exactly what he was looking for. "Dorothy Whitmore, you've been a hard woman to find." She didn't answer. Instead, she shifted to shield the door, hiding whatever was inside from the sheriff's eyes. "We're not trespassing, Marcus," she said, voice low but steady. "This land belongs to someone else now." Crow's eyes narrowed as they settled on me. "Sheriff Crow to you," he corrected with a sly smirk. "And you'd be the fool who bought this worthless patch of dust from the county." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The tension between us was thick enough to slice with a knife. "I own this land," I said, hand resting on my gun holster. "The deed's in my pocket, clear as day." Crow laughed, a sound as ugly as a rattlesnake's rattle. "Legal ownership? That's a good one. You know they didn't tell you about the debts attached to this land? Mrs. Whitmore here owes a heap of money to the bank. Loans, penalties, fees. Comes to a pretty penny." Dorothy's face drained of color. Those debts were the chains that shackled her family, the noose tightening around everything she held dear. "Those loans are forgeries," she spat, anger flaring in her eyes. "My husband never signed anything." Crow shrugged, unconcerned. "Your husband's dead, ma'am. Can't testify to anything. But his signature's on file. The bank's got the records, and the interest keeps climbing." $800, I murmured, the number hitting me harder than a bullet. $800 to ruin a family, to take a home. $800 to throw a sick child into the cold. "No, she doesn't have it," I said, voice low but firm. Crow's smile twisted into something cruel. "Which is why she's coming with us. The bank has ways of settling debts that don't involve kindness." One of the deputies nudged forward, hand resting on his revolver. "Ma'am, you need to come along peaceful." From inside, the harsh cough of a child shattered the morning calm. Dorothy's hands trembled, but her stance remained firm. "My granddaughter's sick," she said. "She can't travel." Crow sneered. "Should have thought of that before running out on your obligations. The child comes, too. The bank always collects." That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to stand by. I stepped between the deputies and Dorothy, my hand hovering near my gun. "No," I said, voice steady but carrying the weight of every wrong I'd seen in this land. The silence stretched tight, electric and dangerous. Crow's eyes locked onto mine, a warning and a challenge. "You don't want to get involved in this, friend." "Too late," I said. "They're on my land now. That makes it my business." One deputy shifted nervously. "Sheriff, maybe we should come back later." "Shut up, Collins," Crow snapped, but he didn't break eye contact with me. "You got any idea what you're meddling with here? Mrs. Whitmore's husband borrowed money, signed papers, then died before paying up. Now the debt falls to his family. Dead men can't dispute forged signatures," I said. "Serious accusation." Crow's smile vanished, replaced by cold fury. "I don't have to prove anything to you. Step aside." I didn't move. Crow's voice dropped. "Dangerous now." "Fine. We'll bring the bank president here with all the paperwork you want. Tomorrow. But I'll be bringing a federal marshal, too. Interfere with legal debts, and you'll be in chains." The trap was closing. Dorothy's grip on her rifle tightened, but she stayed silent, eyes flickering between me and the threat outside. The cough inside grew worse. Zara's tiny frame shook with every breath. Time was running out. I looked at the buildings I now owned, some with sagging roofs, others barely holding walls. This town was falling apart, but here, in the heart of it, something was still alive. Something worth fighting for. The sheriff turned his horse, signaling his men to follow. "Bring your marshal. Bring your papers. But you'll regret this." As they rode off, dust rising behind them, Dorothy finally let out a breath she'd been holding. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "With more men." I nodded. This wasn't just a fight for a patch of dirt anymore. It was war. And I was going to stand my ground. The silence after Sheriff Crow and his men disappeared felt heavy, like the calm just before a thunderstorm. I stood there for a moment, dust settling on my boots, watching Dorothy collapse against the doorframe of the general store. Her hands shook with exhaustion, the weight of everything pressing down on her. Yet even then, I could see a fierce flame burning beneath the surface, a flame of survival, defiance, and desperate hope. I wasn't sure what I'd expected when I bought the town. A quiet patch of land to call my own, maybe a chance at a fresh start. But this place wasn't just dirt and rotting wood. It was a battleground of broken dreams, stolen futures, and people hanging by a thread. Dorothy looked up at me, her eyes weary but filled with questions she dared not ask out loud. I could see the doubts swirling in her mind. Could she trust a stranger who'd just shown up claiming ownership? Would I be another force pushing her family out into the cold? "Your granddaughter's fever's worse," I said gently, nodding toward the faint coughing sounds drifting from inside. Dorothy swallowed hard, steadying herself. "She's fighting, but I'm running out of time," she whispered. I stepped inside the store, the makeshift home where Zara lay curled on a bed of blankets and old boards. The child looked smaller than I expected, almost too frail to carry the weight she bore. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and every shallow breath shook her tiny frame. I knelt beside her, trying to swallow the lump rising in my throat. I wasn't a doctor, but I could see she needed help. Real help, not the scraps Dorothy had been able to gather. Dorothy watched silently, her eyes tracing every movement, every breath her granddaughter took. It was clear this fight was as much about hope as it was survival. I stayed with them through the morning, learning bits of their story between coughs and moments of quiet. Dorothy had lost everything, her home, her husband, her dignity, to a system that didn't care who got crushed along the way. The loans were fake, the signatures forged, but the law didn't care. The bank's greed was a beast that devoured families like hers, leaving nothing but shattered lives. As I listened, I felt a cold rage rising inside me. I'd seen enough injustice in my time to know that this fight wasn't just Dorothy's, it was mine now, too. Outside, the town waited. Empty streets, broken windows, and the faint smell of smoke from a fire struggling to stay alive. But within these ruins, a spark flickered, a spark that could ignite a flame of resistance. I promised Dorothy I wouldn't let them take her, or Zara. Not without a fight. But I also knew that a fight like this wasn't won with guns alone. It took strategy, allies, and a stubborn refusal to back down. That day, we made plans. Dorothy spoke of others, families scattered across the county, victims of the same corrupt schemes. People who'd vanished rather than face the wrath of Sheriff Crow and the bank's enforcers. She told me about Ruth Henley, a woman with fire in her eyes, who'd been gathering those scattered souls, preparing them to stand up. If we were going to hold this town, we couldn't do it alone. I rode out to find Ruth, guided by Dorothy's directions and the whispers of hope carried by the wind. The sun beat down as I approached a small group camped on the outskirts of an abandoned mining settlement, their faces hardened by loss but brightened by resolve. Ruth met me with a steady gaze, the kind that measured a man's soul in seconds. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We know what you're up against," she said. "The bank, Crow, their lies, they've taken too much. We're ready to fight back." Her words settled in me like a lifeline. Together, we began stitching a fragile web of resistance, pulling together families, stories, and courage. We shared information, mapped out the corrupt threads linking the bank to the sheriff's office, and whispered plans of exposing their deceit. But the clock was ticking. Zara's condition worsened, her cough deeper and more desperate. The nearest doctor was in Millfield, 2 days' ride away through unforgiving terrain. Taking her there was a risk, too far, too dangerous, but leaving her here was almost certain death. Dorothy refused to abandon her, and I couldn't argue with a grandmother's love. We decided that some of us would stay behind to protect the town, while others would make the perilous journey to bring help and evidence that could topple the crooked system. As night fell, the town seemed to hold its breath. The wind whispered through broken windows, carrying with it the hopes and fears of those who refused to give up. In that silence, I understood what this place really was. Not just a ghost town, but a symbol of resistance, of survival against impossible odds. And I, who had come looking for a quiet life, had found a cause worth fighting for. The dawn was barely touching the horizon when we gathered at the edge of the ghost town, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on all of us. The air was sharp, tinged with the scent of dry earth and the faint smoke from the fires we'd left behind. I stood beside Dorothy and Ruth, surrounded by a small group of determined souls, families scarred by loss but ready to fight for a future. The plan was clear, though the path was anything but. A few of us would stay, protect the town and the sick child, while the rest rode out to Millfield. We needed a doctor, real medicine, and above all, evidence that could expose the lies woven into the fabric of this land's corruption. Ruth was the leader of the riders. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd carried burdens heavier than these dusty saddles. Her eyes burned with resolve, and I could see the weight of every lost family she was fighting for. "We ride hard and fast," she told us, voice low but firm. "No stopping until we reach Millfield. We're not just asking for help. We're bringing the truth with us." As they mounted, I felt the pull of the fight back home, the fragile shelter we'd built inside the broken town walls. I wasn't ready to leave Dorothy and Zara alone, but I knew the journey was necessary. The group rode out, dust trailing behind like ghosts marking their passage. Left behind, Dorothy and I prepared the town as best we could. We reinforced the doors, gathered what little provisions remained, and steeled ourselves for the storm we knew was coming. Inside, Zara's cough grew harsher, the small girl's body racked with fever. I sat beside her, feeling the fragility of life in the thin rhythm of her breath. Dorothy never left her side, whispering stories and soothing words only a grandmother could know. Time stretched and thinned, each minute feeling like an hour as we waited for any sign from the riders. The silence was a weight pressing against my chest. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped low, a rider appeared on the horizon, a lone figure silhouetted against the fading light. It was Ruth, and behind her rode a small group of others, faces streaked with dirt and exhaustion but shining with hope. They brought news that cut through the silence like a blade. The doctor was on his way, they said, alerted by the evidence we'd sent ahead. More than that, the whispers we'd sent through trusted contacts had reached ears that cared. Journalists, investigators, even federal officials were stirring. But the sheriff wasn't idle. Crow and his deputies had doubled their patrols, their eyes sharp and their hands heavier with threats. The battle was no longer just about a single sick child or a few acres of land. It was about justice, truth, and survival against a system bent on silence and fear. In the days that followed, the town became a fortress of hope and fear. We prepared for what was coming, ready to stand, to fight, and to expose the rot at the heart of this forgotten corner. And through it all, I found a strange sense of belonging. In a place where everything was supposed to be lost, we were carving out a new beginning. The night before the doctor was due to arrive, the wind shifted. It came cold and fast from the north, whipping through the empty streets of the ghost town and carrying with it the scent of rain and trouble. I stood watch at the edge of the barricade, the crude wall of timber and rusted sheet metal we'd pieced together like desperate children building a dam against a flood. The desert was black under the moonless sky, yet my eyes kept catching shapes that weren't there. Phantoms of riders that could have been shadows or could have been real. It was hard to tell anymore. Behind me, the town was quiet, save for the occasional cough from Zara's room. Dorothy hadn't slept in 2 days. Her hands were steady when she fed the child broth, but her face was lined deeper than I'd ever seen. Ruth and the riders who'd gone to Millfield were back now, and the change in the air was obvious. They carried themselves differently, more focused, more certain, but also with the sharpness of people who knew they'd painted a target on their backs. I walked into the old saloon we were using as a meeting hall. Inside, Ruth was leaning over a table lit by a single oil lamp, the shadows carving her face into something fierce. Beside her sat Jacob, one of the younger riders, his right arm wrapped in a bloody bandage. "What happened?" I asked. Jacob looked up, his eyes glassy but burning with quiet anger. "Crow's men caught our trail on the way back. They tried to box us in near dry Washington. I caught a bullet grazing me before we pushed through." Ruth's voice was low and tight. "They know we've got help coming. They'll try to stop it. Which means," I said, "we won't just be waiting for a doctor tomorrow. We'll be waiting for trouble." Her eyes met mine, steady and unflinching. "We've been waiting for trouble since the first day you stepped foot here." The next morning broke gray, the sun smothered by heavy clouds. Rain wasn't common out here, but when it came sudden and hard. By mid-morning, a dust trail appeared in the distance. 2 wagons, 4 riders alongside. The doctor's convoy. The sight stirred something deep in my chest, a mix of relief and dread. We opened the gates to let them through, and the moment the doctor stepped down, I could tell he wasn't just any frontier sawbones. He was tall, with neatly kept hair and a long dark coat that looked like it belonged more in a city than out here. His name was Dr. Elias Monroe, and his eyes didn't miss a thing. Dorothy led him straight to Zara. The rest of us gathered outside the saloon to speak with the other newcomers, 2 men and a woman who introduced themselves as journalists from a paper out of St. Louis. They'd heard whispers about Sheriff Crow and the disappearances, but until now, they'd had nothing solid to print. Ruth laid out the evidence we'd smuggled out, maps, ledgers, signed statements from townsfolk willing to speak. The journalists listened, scribbling furiously, their expressions shifting between horror and grim satisfaction. It was only when one of them asked, "What happens if Crow comes here before we can get this to press?" that the weight of our situation truly pressed down on me. Inside, Dr. Monroe emerged after an hour. He looked tired but not defeated. "She's very sick," he told Dorothy quietly, "but it's not beyond saving. I'll need time, clean water, and space to work. And no interruptions." Ruth's jaw tightened. That last part might be the hardest. We doubled the watch that night. Rain began to fall just after sunset, pattering on the tin roofs and soaking the streets in slick mud. The wind carried distant noises, hard to tell if it was just the storm or something worse. At midnight, we got our answer. It started with the sound of horses, muffled by the rain but steady and coming fast. Jacob was the first to spot them, a line of riders moving like shadows along the ridge. "They're here," he hissed, and within moments, the town was awake. We'd rehearsed this. Everyone who could hold a weapon took position. The barricade gates were reinforced, lanterns doused to give us the darkness as cover. The riders didn't attack immediately. They stopped just outside rifle range, their silhouettes visible only when lightning flashed. At the front sat a broad-shouldered man with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. Even through the storm, I knew it was Crow. His voice carried over the rain, slow and deliberate. "You've got something that belongs to me," he called. "And I'm not just talking about that little girl." Beside me, Ruth's knuckles whitened on her rifle. "He means the evidence," she murmured. Crow's men began to fan out, testing the perimeter. We shouted warnings, told them to back off. Then Crow laughed. "We'll be back at dawn. Either you hand her over, or we take her, and anything else we damn well please." They melted back into the rain, leaving us with the echo of his threat and the knowledge that the real fight was hours away. The rest of the night was a blur of preparations. We moved the doctor and Zara into the most defensible building in town, the old post office, thick stone walls and only 2 narrow windows. Supplies were stacked inside, lanterns placed where they wouldn't give away our position from outside. I spent those hours between watch shifts walking the streets, checking barricades, speaking with townsfolk. Fear was everywhere, but so was resolve. When the first gray light crept over the horizon, the rain had stopped, leaving the ground heavy and slick. And with it came the sound of horses, dozens of them, approaching from the north. This time, there would be no warnings. What happened in the next hours would mark the turning point for all of us. How a forgotten ghost town became the spark for something far larger than itself. We didn't know it yet, but the fight for Zara, for the truth, and for the right to stand our ground was about to draw eyes from far beyond the dusty edges of this land. And there would be no going back. The rain had stopped by dawn, leaving the ground slick and glistening, the air heavy with that damp, metallic scent that comes after a storm. The town was eerily quiet. Too quiet. You could almost hear the boards of the old buildings groaning as if they were uneasy about what was coming. We had spent the night on watch. Ruth and 2 others had patrolled the outer edges of town while Dorothy and I stayed near the infirmary. If you could call a dusty 2-room building with a creaky cot and a shelf of expired medicine an infirmary. Zara's fever had not broken, but she was still breathing, still hanging on. We were hanging on too, though our grip was beginning to ache. When the sun finally crept over the hills, Ruth came in, boots caked with mud, her eyes shadowed by exhaustion. She didn't waste time with greetings. "They're moving," she said simply. I knew what she meant without needing to ask. Crow. His name felt heavier every time it was spoken, as if the man himself carried a weight that bent everything around him. "How many?" I asked. "Half a dozen this morning. Probably more by noon. They're setting up checkpoints." She took a swig from her canteen, her knuckles white. "They're closing the noose, Sam. It's only a matter of time before they come straight here." Dorothy didn't say a word, but I saw her hand tighten around the edge of Zara's blanket. She was thinking the same thing I was. We didn't have time. Not for the doctor to arrive, not for reinforcements, not for justice to crawl its way here through bureaucratic mud. We had hours, maybe less. The meeting. By mid-morning, Ruth had called a meeting in the old saloon, one of the only buildings with enough space to fit us all. The sunlight came in slanted through the broken shutters, catching dust in the air like drifting ghosts. There were maybe 20 of us left in the town. Farmers, widows, a handful of stubborn men who refused to abandon their homes, and 3 or 4 teenagers who had seen too much too soon. Ruth stood at the bar, the cracked wood under her hands. "I'm not gonna sugarcoat it," she began. "Crow's coming. Not to talk. Not to threaten. To end this. A murmur rippled through the room, but no one looked surprised. We have two choices. We stand and fight, or we run and hide. Someone in the back, old Mr. Harlan, snorted. Run and hide where? This land's been ours for generations. I ain't leaving it because of one bully with a badge. A young woman named May shook her head. It's not just him. He's got men, guns, and the law on his side. We fight, we might not make it. Ruth glanced at me, and I knew she was silently asking for my input. I took a slow breath. We can't win in a straight fight, I said. Not against their numbers. But we can make this town a harder target. Slow them down. Make them think twice. How? May asked. Barricades, I replied. Traps. We turn every street into a choke point. We buy time. Enough for the doctor to get here. Enough for the truth to spread. Ruth nodded slowly. We've got wood, rope, nails. We can make it work. The preparation. The rest of the day was a blur of hammering, hauling, and hurried whispers. We overturned wagons and filled them with sandbags. We stacked barrels at alley entrances. We nailed planks across windows, leaving narrow slits for shooting. Dorothy, despite my protests, took charge of making Molotovs from empty whiskey bottles and lamp oil. She was disturbingly efficient. I raised 3 boys during the drought years, she told me, striking a match to test a wick. You learn to make do with what you've got, or you die wishing you had. By sundown, the town had transformed. Every road into the center was blocked. Every rooftop had a lookout. The saloon was stocked with water and what little food we could gather. We were ready, at least as ready as a ragged handful of townsfolk could be. The waiting. Night fell heavy and black. The rain clouds had returned, blotting out the moon. We could hear the wind shift, carrying with it faint sounds, hoofbeats, maybe, or just the creak of the town settling into its armor. Zara's breathing was quieter now. Not better, quieter. Dorothy sat by her side, murmuring lullabies, her voice trembling only when she thought no one could hear. I walked the barricades, checking knots, testing the tension in every rope. Ruth moved ahead of me, her silhouette sharp against the lantern light. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called. It was answered by silence. The first sign. It was just after midnight when we heard it. The low, distant thunder of hooves. This time there was no mistaking it. They were coming. Lanterns winked out across the rooftops as the lookouts signaled the alarm. Men and women moved to their posts, the air suddenly alive with the metallic clicks of rifles being loaded. Ruth appeared at my side, her jaw set. They're taking the south road first, she said. Good, I replied. That's our strongest barricade. But the truth was, no barricade could hold forever. We needed more than walls. We needed a way to end this before they crushed us. Crow arrives. The first figures emerged from the dark like shapes from a nightmare, riders in long coats, their faces hidden under wide-brimmed hats. They didn't rush. They moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of men who believed the land already belonged to them. And then Crow appeared. Even from a distance, he was unmistakable, tall, broad-shouldered, his duster coat swaying like a shadow around him. His horse was black as coal, its eyes catching the faint light like chips of glass. He stopped just outside the barricade, staring at the wooden wall as if it were a minor inconvenience. Ruth. His voice carried easily through the night air. You've got one chance to open this gate and hand over the girl. Do that, and maybe I'll let the rest of you crawl out of here alive. Ruth didn't answer. Crow chuckled, a low, humorless sound. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You're not heroes. You're just squatters clinging to something that was never yours. My hand tightened on the stock of my rifle. The air between us was stretched thin, ready to snap. The breaking point. The standoff lasted seconds, maybe minutes, it was hard to tell. And then a shot rang out. It wasn't ours. It came from Crow's side. The bullet slammed into the top of the barricade, sending splinters raining down. That was all it took. The night erupted in gunfire. Our rifles answered, flashes lighting up the dark. Horses screamed. Men shouted. The barricade shook under the force of the first push. We fought, not for victory, but for every heartbeat we could steal from the night. And as I fired into the shadows, I couldn't help but wonder, how much longer could we hold? The town didn't sleep that night. Even the shadows seemed restless, shifting along the crumbling walls and broken storefronts as if listening for the sound of boots on dirt. Everyone knew Crow was close. I kept watch from the old water tower, my rifle laid across my lap. The stars were hidden behind thick clouds, and the wind carried with it the metallic scent of rain mixed with the acrid memory of gunpowder from the last skirmish. Down below, lanterns flickered in the windows of the main street, their glow a fragile reminder that we were still here, still holding on. Dorothy had been tending to Zara without rest. The doctor Ruth had brought from Millfield had stabilized the girl for now, but he'd also warned us that if she relapsed before his next visit, there might be nothing he could do. It put all of us on edge. Every cough she made in the night was like a knife twisting in the ribs. By early dawn, I spotted them. 6 riders. Crow at the front, wearing that black oilskin coat that seemed to drink in the light. His hat was pulled low, but I could see the smirk even from this distance. He wasn't riding in with guns blazing. Not yet. This was intimidation, a show of control. When they reached the edge of town, Crow didn't dismount. He sat tall in the saddle, scanning the street like he was looking at something that already belonged to him. "Morning, folks," he called, his voice carrying in the still air. "I hear you've been busy, bringing outsiders into my county, stirring up trouble, making promises you can't keep." Ruth stepped forward from the line of townsfolk, her shotgun resting across her arms. "This isn't your county, Crow. You don't own the people here." Crow chuckled. "That's funny, Ruth. Because last I checked, I decide who stays and who disappears out here. And you," he pointed a finger at me, "you're a new face. Which means you don't understand the rules yet." I didn't answer. My grip tightened on the rifle, but I kept it aimed low. Crow leaned forward in his saddle. "Here's my offer. You give me that girl, the one with the fever, and every outsider you brought here rides out before sundown. Do that, and I let the rest of you live." The air went dead quiet. You could hear the leather creak on his reins, the distant caw of a crow in the hills. Ruth's voice was ice. "You're not touching her." Crow's smile faded. "Shame. I was hoping we could avoid another graveyard filling up." He gave a small signal with his hand, and his men rode off in different directions, circling the outskirts. It was a message, they'd be back, and not alone. We gathered in the meeting hall immediately after. The old wooden building groaned in the wind, the boards warping from years of neglect, but it was the only place big enough to hold everyone. Faces were pale. Some were scared, others angry. "They're coming in force," Ruth said. "We've got maybe 2 days before they hit us hard. We either prepare to fight, or we evacuate the women and children now." Dorothy shook her head. "If we send them away, Crow will hunt them down one by one. The only chance we have is to stand together." I spoke up. "If we fight, we need more than rifles. We need proof. Real proof of what Crow's done, so when this is over, the law, real law, has something to act on." "That's a tall order," said Elias, the blacksmith. "He's burned half the evidence already." "Not all of it," Ruth replied. "There's a ledger. Keeps track of every bribe, every land theft, every payoff. Crow keeps it in a safe at the old mine office. Get that, and we can end him without firing a shot." There it was, the plan that could save us or get us all killed. That night, I went with Ruth and Elias under cover of darkness. The mine office sat at the edge of the hills, a squat brick building half swallowed by weeds and dust. We moved slow, every creak of the floorboards inside sounding like a shout. The safe was there, just as Ruth said. Old but solid, the kind built to survive fire and thieves alike. Elias went to work with his tools while I kept watch at the doorway. Every second stretched into an eternity, my eyes straining to see through the dark. Finally, with a low metallic click, the safe opened. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the ledger. I flipped it open just enough to see the neat, damning handwriting. Dates, names, payments. Enough to bury Crow in a federal courtroom. We didn't have time to celebrate. A shadow moved across the moonlight outside. Then, another. I hissed to Elias and Ruth, and we slipped out the back just as gunfire tore through the front wall. They chased us through the hills, bullets cracking over our heads. We dove behind rocks, scrambled through narrow passes, the ledger clutched tight against my chest. When we finally made it back to town, my legs were shaking, lungs burning, but the book was still in my hands. By dawn, Crow knew it was gone. And now, the fight wasn't just inevitable, it was coming faster than any of us feared. We fortified the town, set up barricades, and posted lookouts in shifts. Every nail we hammered, every sandbag we stacked was a statement, you can't erase us. And deep inside, I felt something shift. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was justice clawing its way through the dirt, ready to see the sun. The next morning, the town woke to a silence so complete it felt unnatural. The usual creak of shifting wood, the soft groan of wind through broken shutters, gone. Even the dust seemed to hang in the air, suspended like the moment before a trigger pull. I stepped out into the main street with my rifle slung low, eyes sweeping across the empty facades. Dorothy was already up, standing at the corner of the saloon with her coat drawn tight against the chill. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set. "They're close," she said without turning toward me. "I can feel it." I wanted to dismiss it as nerves, but deep down I knew she was right. We had been too quiet for too long. The sheriff's men would never let us strengthen without striking. Ruth emerged from the blacksmith shop, where she and the others had been reinforcing barricades. "Scouts say Crow's riders are camped less than a mile east," she reported. "Looks like 30 men, maybe more. They're waiting for something. Or someone," Dorothy murmured. The unease in her voice pulled at me, and I glanced toward the horizon. The eastern hills were just dark humps in the distance, but if Ruth's scouts were right, that darkness hid more than rock and scrub. We gathered in the old church, the only building large enough to hold everyone. The benches were warped, the floorboards uneven, but there was a sense of sacred gravity in the air. People were tired, yes, tired in their bones, but they were also angry. "They want us scared," Ruth said, standing before them. "They want us to give up Zara, our land, our lives, everything, without a fight. That's not going to happen." The murmurs of agreement were low but fierce. I stepped forward. "We don't have the numbers to face them in open combat. But we do have something they don't, this ground. These walls. And the will to hold them." A plan began to form as we spoke. Choke points, hidden firing positions, signals for retreat if one line fell. Every man and woman capable of holding a weapon was assigned a place. Even those too old or too young to fight were given a role, fetching water, carrying ammunition, tending the wounded. Through the cracked church windows, I saw the first thin strands of smoke rise from the east. My gut twisted. They were coming. By afternoon, the town was a coiled spring. We'd hidden Zara and the doctor, who had finally arrived the night before, deep in the cellar beneath the old post office. Her fever had broken during the night, but she was still too weak to move. The doctor, a gaunt man named Harlan with sharp eyes and quicker hands, refused to leave her side. "I didn't ride halfway across the desert to let her die because some badge wants to make an example," he told me. When the sun dipped low, the sound began, a low, rolling thunder that rattled the boards under our feet. Hooves. Crow's riders came into view as the last light of day bled across the sky. They moved in a loose wedge, rifles across their saddles, faces hard and unreadable. At the center rode Crow himself, a dark silhouette in a wide-brimmed hat. Even at a distance, the way he sat his horse was all authority, like the land bent itself to him. He didn't speak when they reached the edge of town. Instead, he dismounted slowly, dusting his coat sleeve with deliberate care. The kind of slow, controlled movement meant to remind everyone watching that he was in no hurry, because he believed he was already in control. "Evenin'," he called finally, his voice carrying down the street. "I hear you've been keeping something that belongs to me." Nobody moved. Crow's smile was small and dangerous. "I'll give you one chance to walk away. Leave the girl, leave this place, and you might live long enough to see another sunrise." Dorothy stepped out from behind the barricade, her shotgun resting across her arm like it had grown there. "She's not yours," she said, her voice steady. "Neither is this town." Crow tilted his head, studying her. "You've got grit, lady. I respect that. But grit won't stop bullets." Ruth appeared on the opposite side, rifle in hand. "Neither will cowardice," she called back. A ripple of tension passed through the street. I could feel it like heat. One wrong move and the air itself would ignite. Crow's eyes slid to me. "And you're not from here. What's worth dying for in a place like this?" I didn't answer. Words wouldn't change what was coming. For a moment, it was just the wind and the faint creak of leather. Then Crow's smile vanished, and his hand twitched toward his holster. The street exploded into chaos. Gunfire cracked, echoing off the walls. The first line of riders charged, hooves striking sparks from the packed dirt. Our barricades held, at first. Bullets splintered wood and shattered glass. The air filled with smoke, dust, and the sharp, acrid tang of burned powder. I saw Dorothy drop one man clean off his horse with a single blast. Ruth was a shadow on the rooftops, her shots precise and devastating. Crow didn't charge. He stood back, watching, calculating. He was waiting for the moment we'd break. And in the middle of it all, I realized this wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a message, to every small town, every family crushed under men like Crow, that someone, somewhere had fought back. That thought was still in my head when I heard the sound that turned my blood cold. A door slamming open. The post office. I spun toward it and saw two of Crow's men slipping inside. They were going for Zara. The night after the failed truce felt like an open wound, raw and bleeding into every corner of the town. The storm that had been brewing for weeks now sat heavy in the air, thick with the scent of gunpowder and burning wood from the sheriff's warning fires outside the walls. Sleep was a distant dream. The slightest noise sent us all reaching for our rifles. I sat in the old livery stable with Ruth and Jonah, our makeshift war council spread out around a rough plank table. A lantern flickered in the center, its trembling light dancing over maps, notes, and the smudged photographs we'd risked everything to obtain. Images of Crow's men burying bodies in the dry gulch, ledger pages showing the land grab payments funneled through shell companies, and a single grainy shot of Crow himself accepting a handoff from a man in a federal agent's coat. Ruth spoke first, her voice low but hard as stone. "They'll come before dawn. Crow's not the patient type. He knows every hour gives us more time to get that evidence out. We need to be ready to hold them off until the doc and the others from Millfield arrive." Jonah leaned forward, rubbing his temples. "We're short on men, short on ammo, short on food. Hell, we're short on everything except trouble." "Then we make what we have enough," Ruth replied sharply. "We've got high ground, tight alleys, and people with nothing left to lose. That's worth more than bullets." Outside, the town had transformed into something between a fortress and a graveyard. Barricades of overturned wagons and nailed-together planks blocked the main approaches. Rope traps stretched across the side streets, ready to snap a horse's legs if Crow's men tried a flanking maneuver. Every able-bodied man, woman, and even some of the older children had been given a role: lookout, runner, or fighter. Dorothy was in the schoolhouse with Zara, tending to her fever and preparing supplies for the wounded we knew we'd have by sunrise. I wanted to be by her side, but I also knew my place was on the front line. Every time I thought of her and the child in that dim, quiet room, my resolve hardened. I would not let this place fall. Near midnight, a rider came in from the ridge. His horse was lathered, sides heaving. "They're coming," he panted. 2 dozen, maybe more. Saw the glint of rifles. They're moving fast. We didn't waste time. The bells rang, 3 long clangs that echoed through the dusty streets. People moved like clockwork, every step rehearsed in whispers over the past week. The air was alive with the creak of leather, the clink of metal, the hurried prayers muttered under breath. I took my position at the north barricade, crouching behind an old wagon reinforced with iron plates we'd scavenged from the abandoned rail yard. Jonah was beside me, loading his rifle with hands that shook only slightly. "You ready for this?" he asked. "No," I said honestly. "But we do it anyway." The moon slid out from behind the clouds just enough to paint the horizon silver. That's when I saw them, shadows stretching long in the dust, a line of riders fanning out like a black tide. Crow was at the center, tall in the saddle, his coat billowing behind him like the wings of some carrion bird. They didn't charge at first. They came slow, deliberate, letting the fear work its way into our bones. Then Crow's voice cut through the night, smooth as oil but cold as a blade. "This is your last chance. Give me the girl, the evidence, and the outsiders, and I'll let the rest of you rot in peace." Ruth stepped out from behind the barricade just far enough for her voice to carry. "You've taken enough from this land. You're not taking one more soul." Crow chuckled, a sound that made my skin crawl. "So be it." The first shot cracked the night open. Then the world became a blur of fire and noise. Muzzle flashes lit the dark like lightning, and the air filled with the sharp tang of gunpowder. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the barricade shuddered under the impact of bullets and bodies. I fired until the barrel of my rifle burned against my hand, then switched to the revolver. Jonah went down beside me with a cry, a grazing wound along his arm, but he gritted his teeth and kept reloading. The traps we'd set earlier snapped shut, throwing riders from their mounts. Every foot they gained was paid for in blood. Still, they kept coming. By the time the eastern sky began to pale, our barricades were splintered, and our ammunition was nearly gone. I could see Crow pushing forward, his eyes locked on the schoolhouse where Dorothy and Zara waited. He wasn't even trying to hide his intent now, he wanted to break us at our heart. Then, just when I thought the line would break, a horn sounded from the west. My heart stopped. For a moment, I thought Crow had brought more men. But then I saw them, dust rising behind a column of riders, the gleam of a doctor's wagon in the center. Millfield had come. And they weren't alone. Mixed among the townsfolk were men wearing federal badges on their coats. Crow saw them too. His expression didn't change, but his hands tightened on the reins. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the tide had just turned. The arrival of the federal deputies from Millfield was like a sudden rainstorm breaking a week-long drought, unexpected, overwhelming, and with the power to reshape everything. Their horses thundered down the main street, kicking up a cloud of dust that blinded both friend and foe for a moment. Shouts rang out, orders barked in sharp tones that cut through the chaos like a blade. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something like hope flicker inside me. The federal agents dismounted with practiced efficiency, rifles raised and eyes scanning every shadow, every doorway, every whisper of movement. Behind them came the doctor's wagon, where Dr. Harlan and his assistants hurriedly unpacked supplies and tended to the wounded. Crow's face tightened when he saw the newcomers, but he didn't retreat. If anything, his jaw set harder. The battle had shifted, but he was still determined to fight for every inch of ground. One of the federal marshals, a tall woman with steel-gray eyes, took command immediately. She wasn't here for a social call. She was here to dismantle the corruption that had turned this once-forgotten town into a battlefield. "We've got warrants," she announced, voice carrying authority that silenced the gunfire for a heartbeat. "Marcus Crow, you and your deputies are under arrest for illegal land seizures, forgery, and conspiracy." Crow sneered. "You think some papers will save you?" The marshal didn't flinch. "They already do." Suddenly, several men stepped forward from the townsfolk, Dorothy among them, carrying stacks of documents, photographs, and witness statements. Ruth held up a ledger with signatures that had been expertly forged. Evidence that had taken months to gather, pieced together by desperate families who refused to be crushed any longer. The tide turned swiftly after that. Crow's men, realizing their grip on power was slipping, faltered and then scattered. Some tried to flee, but the marshals were quick to block their escape routes. Crow himself was dragged from his horse, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. With the immediate threat contained, the town slowly began to breathe again. The people who had gathered behind barricades, who had prepared for the worst, now shared tentative smiles and tired embraces. We'd survived. But survival was only the beginning. Inside the church, the community gathered to discuss what came next. The corrupt bank loans were declared invalid. The forged documents were voided. Land was returned to the families who had been cheated and threatened for so long. Dorothy's hands shook as she accepted the official papers that confirmed her ownership of the general store and the surrounding land. Zara, though still weak, smiled faintly beside her, cradled gently by the doctor. I looked around the room, faces etched with hardship but alight with newfound hope. The town had been more than a ghost town, it had been a battleground for justice. And now, it was home. Months passed as we rebuilt. New businesses opened. Children laughed in the streets. The land, once scarred by greed and neglect, began to heal. The small garden that had surprised me on my first day, here grew into a lush patchwork of vegetables and flowers, tended by hands that had once only known hardship. I stayed, no longer a stranger passing through but a part of this fragile community. The days of loneliness and wandering were behind me. Here, among these people who had fought and survived, I found something I hadn't expected, a purpose, a family, a future. And as I watched Zara run through the streets with the other children, her laughter ringing clear and bright, I knew that this was why I'd come. Not for the land, not for the money, but for the chance to protect something worth fighting for. The weeks following the arrest of Crow and his deputies brought a calm that felt almost foreign to the town. But calm wasn't peace, it was the quiet before the hard work of healing began. The scars left by years of corruption, betrayal, and hardship didn't disappear overnight. The bank's grip had been broken, but the families who'd lost their farms, their homes, and their dignity were left to pick up the pieces. Many faced barren fields, broken equipment, and deep debts that no official document could erase. I found myself stepping into roles I never imagined: mediator, protector, sometimes even a reluctant preacher. The townsfolk looked to me for leadership, and despite my own doubts, I couldn't turn away. Dorothy was tireless, her spirit unbroken even as she juggled caring for Zara and helping organize the community's rebuilding efforts. Watching her, I understood that strength wasn't just about fighting, it was about enduring, adapting, and refusing to give up. One morning, as the sun climbed over the horizon and painted the town in gold, I rode out to the old mining camp where Samuel Chen, the whistleblower, had been hiding. He was a quiet man, haunted by guilt but determined to make amends. We pored over ledgers and letters, tracing the tangled web of the bank's deceit. Every signature forged, every debt fabricated, every land title stolen. Chen's courage had given us the key to unlocking the full scale of the corruption, and his testimony had made the federal case airtight. Back in town, children played in the dusty streets, their laughter a balm to the weary souls of their parents. The general store was bustling again, stocked with goods brought in from neighboring settlements. The blacksmith's forge glowed day and night, shaping horseshoes and tools that would breathe new life into the land. But not all wounds were visible. Some battles were fought in silence, in the haunted eyes of those who had lost everything, in the sleepless nights of mothers watching over sick children, in the quiet doubts that crept into the hearts of the strongest among us. I found myself standing at the edge of the town one evening, watching the last light fade from the sky. The wind carried the scent of sage and earth, and I thought about how far we'd come, and how far we still had to go. Rebuilding a town was more than fixing walls and planting crops. It was rebuilding trust, creating community, and forging a future where no one would have to fight alone. And as I stood there, the distant sound of a guitar drifted on the breeze. Soft, hopeful, a song that promised better days ahead. The days grew longer and warmer as spring pressed its way through the stubborn crust of winter's hold. The town was no longer a ghost but a living, breathing place, filled with chatter, the clang of hammers, and the steady rhythm of life reclaiming what was lost. Yet beneath this renewal, a shadow lingered, something I couldn't shake no matter how far I rode or how late I stayed up talking with Ruth and Dorothy. The forces that had tried to crush us weren't gone. They were waiting. Watching. Late one evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills and the sky turned the color of burning embers, a rider arrived on the outskirts of town. His horse was weary, its coat matted with dust and sweat. He carried a message, one I'd been dreading. The bank's reach extended far beyond this territory. Crow was just one piece in a much larger machine, and the head of that machine was coming for us. The men who'd sent Crow were powerful men, wealthy, ruthless, and backed by lawmen who wore their badges like shields against justice. They didn't just want our land. They wanted to send a message. Ruth gathered the community in the church, her voice steady but heavy with urgency. We fought hard to protect our homes. But now, the fight gets bigger. We need to be ready, not just to defend this town but to expose the entire system that's been stealing from families like ours. Dorothy nodded, eyes blazing with fierce determination. We have each other. We have the truth. And we have the will to see this through. I felt the weight of those words settle on my shoulders. We'd come so far, but the battle wasn't over. It was only beginning. In the days that followed, preparations intensified. Scouts were sent to gather information. The townsfolk trained with renewed purpose, sharpening skills they never imagined needing. We fortified the town's defenses and worked tirelessly to secure safe routes for the families. At night, I found myself drawn to the schoolhouse where Zara was slowly recovering. Her pale cheeks were starting to flush with health, and her laughter was a fragile but powerful sound that kept me grounded. One evening, as I sat by her bedside, she whispered, "Will they come back?" I didn't have a perfect answer, but I squeezed her hand gently and said, "If they do, we'll be ready." The coming storm was not just about land or money. It was a fight for dignity, for justice, for the right to live free from fear. And no matter the cost, we would stand together. The dawn broke over the town like a fragile promise, soft pink and gold spilling across the sky. But beneath the peaceful colors lay a storm waiting to erupt, an inevitable reckoning that every heartbeat in that town felt deep in their bones. We had known for days that the bank's true enforcers were coming. Not just a handful of deputies this time, but a force backed by mercenaries and corrupt officials, armed with the law and a thirst to crush the last flicker of rebellion. The kind of men who wore suits in the daylight and carried guns at night. I stood on the main street, watching the horizon as dust clouds rolled closer, an advancing army that threatened to erase everything we had rebuilt. Beside me, Ruth checked the cartridges in her rifle, her eyes sharp and unyielding. Dorothy held Zara's hand, the child wrapped in a blanket but steady enough now to face whatever was coming. The people of the town lined the streets, faces set with grim determination, hands gripping tools, rifles, whatever weapons they could muster. This wasn't just about land or money anymore. It was about survival, about justice, about carving out a place where children like Zara could grow up without fear. The first shots rang out just as the sun cleared the hills, a brutal announcement that the battle had begun. Gunfire erupted, echoing off the weathered wooden buildings and jagged cliffs beyond. The air filled with the roar of rifles, the screams of horses, the clash of metal on metal. Our makeshift barricades shuddered under the onslaught, but the town fought back with a fierceness born from desperation and hope. I found myself in the thick of it, moving through the chaos with a rifle in one hand and resolve in the other. Crow's shadow loomed large among the attackers, his sneer replaced by cold fury. But the federal marshals, led by the steadfast woman who had first arrested him, held the line with us, their badges symbols of a fragile but unbreakable law. Hours passed like minutes, every moment a blur of gunfire and shouted orders. I caught glimpses of Dorothy moving with quiet strength, tending the wounded and rallying the fighters. Ruth was everywhere at once, striking down threats, organizing defenses, inspiring hope. And Zara, tucked safely away, was the reason we all fought harder, refused to yield. Then, in the chaos, a sudden silence fell. From the shadows of the town hall, Samuel Chen emerged, carrying a bundle of documents and ledgers, proofs, affidavits, and recordings that exposed the full extent of the bank's corruption. His voice rang out over the gathered fighters and attackers alike, reading aloud the names, the crimes, the cover-ups. The mercenaries faltered, the lawmen hesitated. The truth was a weapon sharper than any rifle, cutting through the darkness like a blade of light. Crow's face twisted in rage as the townspeople, emboldened by the evidence and united by their fight, pressed forward. The corrupt system that had ruled through fear began to crumble under the weight of their own lies. When the dust finally settled, the sun was high and bright, illuminating a town battered but unbroken. Crow and his enforcers were taken away in chains. Their reign of terror ended not just by bullets, but by the courage and unity of a community that refused to be broken. The federal court annulled the forged debts, restoring the rightful ownership to the families who had fought so hard. The land, the buildings, and the dreams buried beneath years of greed were finally reclaimed. I stood beside Dorothy and Zara, watching the town come alive with laughter, music, and the promise of new beginnings. The garden bloomed fiercely, a symbol of resilience and hope. I had come to this place alone, expecting ruins and silence. Instead, I found life, a family forged not by blood, but by shared struggle and unwavering resolve. As I watched Zara chase the sunlight across the dusty street, I knew this was more than just a town. It was a home. And here, at last, I was ready to stay. If you were in his shoes, would you fight the same fight? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your story. Don't forget to like the video if this tale moved you, and explore the other videos on screen for more unforgettable stories.